Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
It's coming up to midday here. Let's take a look at Big Ben. There it is behind us. Can only mean one thing. It's Prime Minister's questions, and it's the final PMQs of 2015. And that's not all. Laura Kunsberg is here as well. Laura, let's not talk about PMQs. Let's talk about the European Summit that's coming up tomorrow night, the big dinner. What do you know?
Well, you know what's been really interesting to me in the last 24 hours? Obviously, we've been trying to talk to people who are close to what's actually going on. And there's a sense to me that there's almost a set of nerves around the fact that the domestic political situation, David Cameron's put himself on this hook over this benefit promise. But the rest of the negotiations, while there has been progress in them, they're not done. They're not signed off. No. They're not sealed.
Yes, we were told they were, of course.
And indeed, I mean, the Europe Minister, David Lidington, said that the technical talks were complete. But my understanding is that that's actually a kind interpretation of where things are really at. And, you know, yes, there is sound and fury around the benefits issue because the public rightly cares about
and
this issue.
And it's one of the tangible issues as well. It's a substantive issue.
Indeed. And of course, it was in the Conservative manifesto. So for Eurosceptics in the party, it's an ideal stick to knock David Cameron around the head with. But there is, from conversations that I've had with people, a bit of concern that the biggest issue, as most people would actually see it if you stand back, the question of countries in the euro and countries outside the euro, big, fundamental economic questions about how that works for the next 10, 20, 30, 50 years. And that's not quite getting the sort of political bandwidth that maybe it deserves. But there has been progress there, but it isn't done.
But it's also, it cannot be fully answered, because we know that the German Chancellor and the French President want to move to a more integrated Eurozone, but they're not going to do so before either of their elections in 2017. And until we see the nature of the Eurozone, it's quite hard then to define the relationship between the Eurozone and the rest of us.
Absolutely. I mean, this is all like juggling water. There are so many machinations, and not only just the number of countries involved, not only the number of issues involved, not only the fact that EU regulation and law as it exists is already extremely complicated, but there's a huge amount of crystal ball gazing here. So the number of potential machinations are extraordinary. And of course, also in a negotiation process, we might find that one bit in one of the hideously named baskets gets exchanged for another bit that's in one of the other hideously named basket. Yes, basket swapping. Maybe that'll be the new thing for 2016, where we had political cross-dressing and all sorts of things, and maybe basket swapping will be the next thing. But the complexities of this are huge, enormous, and narrowing down to a red line, which for some Conservatives, it has become a red line.
Yes.
How far they get on benefits is not necessarily actually the best representation of where this debate really is, and it's very, very fluid. But the political focus on the benefits issue, that's right there. That's true. And of course, there's a huge guessing game going on as to where we'll actually get to and all of that.
Well, have you had any guidance as to what the Prime Minister hopes to achieve tomorrow night at this dinner?
I think the big thing for Downing Street is it's about a political momentum. So if we think actually what's happened in the last 7 months since the general election, officials have been working very, very hard trying to get someplace on all of these issues, and there has been some progress. As I understand it, what's happened, the technical official bit has sort of gone as far as it can go before the bosses say, actually, I'll agree to that bit. Yeah. Actually, I might agree to that bit. You sort out the technicalities. You sort out the technicalities. And what David Cameron is trying to do in the next 24, 36 hours is create a sense of political momentum that can unblock the very difficult technical logjams on some of this bit. And if you think of it this way, sort of each leader, all 28 of them, will have in front of them a sort of menu of options, as many as 10 options, I understand, in each of the different 4 categories. Stay with me.
So that's 40 then.
So that's 40.
10 times 4 is 40.
Yes.
It's a long night.
That's good. That's going to give me something to say in the next couple of days when it seems completely confusing. 40 different things. And they will sort of essentially agree or start to agree a pick and mix.
Ah, I see.
So I could do that bit, but I couldn't do that bit. But there will be, there are shreds of information coming out here and there. A good source in the European Council yesterday suggested to me that a 6-month benefit ban was a starting place for this week's negotiations.
Hold that thought, because we're going to go over to the final Prime Minister's questions of 2015. Here's the Prime Minister.
Join me in wishing Major Tim Peake well as he begins his 6-month stay at the International Space Station. We all watched his exciting takeoff yesterday, and as the first Briton to visit the International Space Station, it signals a landmark in this country's involvement in space exploration, and I'm proud that the government took the decision to fund it. We wish him the best of luck. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others, and in addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Mr. Richard Graham.
Can I welcome today's fall in unemployment to 5.2%, the lowest in almost 10 years. Mr. Speaker, stalking is a horrible crime. Dr. Ellen Aston, a GP in Gloucester, resident in Cheltenham, was harassed for several years by a stalker who slashed her tyres, hacked her water pipe, cut off her gas supply and put foul items in her letterbox. She and her family suffered dreadfully. The judge in sentencing said if he could give more than the maximum 5 years, he certainly would have done. Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend for Cheltenham has raised sentencing guidelines with the Justice Secretary. Would my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, today give his support for greater flexibility and longer sentencing where it is clear that a stalker is a real menace?
Well, first of all, let me say how much I agree with my honourable friend that stalking is a dreadful crime. That is why we've introduced 2 new stalking offences during this Parliament. I'll certainly make sure that the honourable member for Cheltenham has his meeting with my right honourable friend, the Justice Secretary. I can't comment on the individual case without looking at it in more detail, but we are taking the action necessary and will continue to do so. On unemployment, I'm sure the whole House will want to welcome the fact that there are 500,000 more people in work in our country in the last year alone. We've had wages growing above inflation every month for a year, and the claimant count is at the lowest level since 1975. I'm sure this will have a welcome right across the House.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I start by wishing you, all members of the House and all staff here, and Major Tim Peake, who's not on the planet at this time, a very happy Christmas and a peaceful New Year. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the number of days that patients are being kept in hospital because there is nowhere safe to discharge them to has doubled since the Prime Minister took office. On the 4th of November, I asked him if he could guarantee there will be no winter crisis in the NHS this winter. He didn't answer then. I wonder if he'd be able to help us with an answer today.
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me join the right honourable gentleman and be very clear that I don't want to wish him the season's greetings. I want a full happy Christmas for the right honourable gentleman and everyone in the House.
Could I start by wishing you, all members of the House and all staff here, and Major Tim Peake, who's not on the planet at this time, a very happy Christmas and a peaceful New Year.
He asked specifically about the NHS, and let me answer specifically about the NHS. The average stay in hospital has actually fallen since I became Prime Minister, from 5.5 days to 5 days. And one of the reasons for that is that we kept our promises on the NHS. We put an extra £12 billion in the last Parliament, and we'll be putting £19 billion in cash terms in the NHS in this Parliament.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, just for the record, I did say Happy Christmas.
He never listens anyway.
but maybe the Prime Minister wasn't listening at the time. If he's so happy, Mr. Speaker, about the National Health Service, could he explain then why he's decided to cancel the publication of NHS performance data this winter? And there was a time when the Prime Minister was all in favour of transparency, and it's not that long ago. In fact, it was 2011 when he said, and I quote, "Information is power. It lets people hold the powerful to account, giving them the tools they need to take on politicians and bureaucrats." Is it because the number of people being kept waiting on trolleys in A&E has gone up more than fourfold that he doesn't want to publish these statistics?
Well, first of all, the data that he quoted in his first question was not published before this government came to office. That's right. And let me quote him some data about the NHS. Let me just take an average day today compared with 5 years ago when I became Prime Minister. On an average day in the NHS today, there are 4,400 more operations. There are 21,000 more outpatient appointments. Yes, there are challenges in A&E, but there are 2,100 more people seen within 4 hours today than 5 years ago. And there is more data published in our NHS than there ever was under Labour.
Mr. Speaker, there are huge pressures on the NHS, and they are largely due to the pressures on the adult social care system, which is under enormous stress at the moment. It indeed has been huge cuts in adult social care because of cuts in local government funding. The NHS Chief Executive, Simon Stevens, has called for a radical upgrade in prevention and public health. So would the Prime Minister agree with me that cutting these crucial services is indeed a false economy?
Well, first of all, we're increasing the money that is able to go into social care by having the 2% precept on the council tax so that local councils can spend more. But I noticed that the Right Honourable Gentleman mentions Simon Stevens. Our NHS plan is Simon Stevens' plan. The NHS, for the first time, got together and wrote their plan. They asked us for £8 billion. They asked for the money up front. We committed to that plan, unlike Labour at the last election, and we funded it up front. And that's why we see a bigger, better NHS. But none of this would be possible, including the action on social care that we're taking with the Better Care Fund. None of this would be possible without the growing economy that we have and the more jobs we've created.
Mr. Speaker, the problem is to do with adult social care. This morning, the NHS Confederation said on BBC Radio 4, and I quote, "Cuts to social care and public health will continue to pile more pressure on hospital and will worsen deficits in the acute sector. What was announced on the social care in the autumn statement falls well short of what's needed. The Health Foundation estimates a funding shortfall of £6 billion will be in place by 2020. How is the government planning to meet that shortfall?
Well, I'm glad the Right Honourable Gentleman listens to the Today programme. He might bother to go on it one of these days. That would be a bit of transparency, a bit of sunlight would be very welcome. If he wants to swap quotations, this is what the chairman of the Local Government Association says. The Local Government Association has long called for further flexibility in the setting of council tax, and today's announcement will go some way to allowing a number of councils to raise the money needed. £1.5 billion more increase in the Better Care Fund announced today is good news. It's this government that funded the NHS. They didn't. It's this government that set up the Better Care Fund. They opposed it. It's this government that has the strong and growing economy. And I note, question 4, and still not a welcome for the unemployment figures.
Mr. Speaker, the issue of adult social care and cuts in local government spending are very much the responsibility of central government. Can he confirm that NHS trusts are forecasting a deficit of £2.2 billion this year? And indeed, I understand, and the Prime Minister, as part of the Oxford anti-austerity movement, will be concerned about this, that his own local healthcare trust is predicting a £1.7 million deficit. There is a problem of of NHS funding, has he forgotten the simple maxim that prevention is cheaper and better than cure?
How can he possibly complain about NHS funding when his party didn't commit to fund the Stevens plan? That we are spending £19 billion more on the NHS, money that wouldn't be available if we'd listened to the Labour Party. Now, he says that social care is a responsibility of government. Everything is a responsibility of government, but in fact it is local councils that decide how much to spend on social care, and with the Better Care Fund they have more to spend. But I challenge him again. How do we pay for the NHS? We pay for it by more growth, more jobs, more people having a livelihood. Is he going to welcome that at Christmas time, or doesn't he care about the reduction in unemployment?
Mr. Speaker, I have a question from Abby. Abby wants to train to be a midwife, and she says, I'm 28 years old. This year I left my successful career to go back into university to retrain as a midwife. I already have a debt of £25,000 from my first degree. Well over half of my cohort have studied a first degree in another subject, and many of my fellow colleagues have children and partners with elderly parents and mortgages. Many people will be put off by the lack of financial support and massive debts. In the spirit of Christmas, will the Prime Minister have a word with his friend the Chancellor, who's sitting next to him, it can be done very quickly, to reverse the cuts in the nurse bursary scheme so that we do get people like Abby trained to be midwives, which will help all of us in the future?
Well, first of all, I want Abby to train as a midwife, and I can guarantee that the funding will be there for her training, because there are thousands more midwives operating in the NHS today than when I became Prime Minister. Now, he mentions the question of nurse bursaries, and the truth is today, 2 out of 3 people who want to become nurses can't do that because of the constraints on the system. And our new system will mean many more doctors, many more nurses. Already we've got 10,000 more doctors in the NHS since I became Prime Minister, and 4,500 more nurses. But all of this is happening, Mr. Speaker, because the economy is growing, because the deficit is falling, unemployment is coming down. You can fill up a tank of gas at less than £1 a litre. Wages are going up. Britain is getting stronger as we go into Christmas because our economy is getting stronger too.
Tulip Siddiq.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to represent a constituency that boasts of 7 synagogues, 4 mosques, over 35 churches and 2 temples. However, last night, Donald Trump reiterated that one of these communities would not be allowed into America simply because of their religion, seemingly unaware of how divisive this is. In our country, we have legislation that stops people from entering the country who are deemed not to be conducive to public good. Does the Prime Minister agree that the law should be applied equally to everyone, or should we be making exceptions for billionaire politicians?
No, well, first of all, let me join the Honourable Lady in being proud of representing a country which I think has some claim to say we are one of the most successful multiracial, multi-faith, multi-ethnic countries anywhere in the world. There's more to do to build opportunity and fight discrimination. Now, I agree with her that it is right that we exclude people when they are going to radicalise or encourage extremism. I happen to disagree with her about Donald Trump. I think his remarks are divisive, stupid and wrong, and I think if he came to visit our country, I think he'd unite us all against him.
Nigel Adams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This Friday sadly sees the closure of Britain's last deep coal mine at Kellingley in my constituency. Will my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, join me in thanking the hundreds of workers who will be working their last shift this Friday, and also praise the thousands of workers whose bravery and hard graft over the last 50 years has helped warm our homes, power our factory and keep our lights on?
No, well, I think my honourable friend speaks very strongly for his constituents, and I'm very happy to join him in thanking people who've worked so hard at that mine and elsewhere. And obviously it is a difficult time, and as part of the closure process, the government has put nearly £18 million to ensure that the workers receive the same package as the miners at recently closed Thoresby. And that finance has allowed the mine to keep... It's all very well. Honourable members opposite shouting. Can I just tell them something, right? Can I just tell them something, right? Right, this is the official policy of the Labour Party. Just right. We must take action to keep fossil fuels in the ground. Right, that is their policy. Right. They've also got a policy, by the way, of reopening coal mines. So presumably, what they're going to do is dig a big hole in the ground and then sit there and do nothing. What a metaphor for his leadership of his party.
Douglas Carswell. 3 years ago, the Prime Minister couldn't have been any clearer. His EU renegotiation would mean returning control over social and employment law. Is he still seeking that?
Well, I always find it hard to satisfy the honourable gentleman because, of course, he joined the Conservative Party when we weren't committed to a referendum, and he left the Conservative Party after we committed to a referendum. So I'm not surprised that he's giving his new boss as much trouble as he used to give me. But with that, I'll wish them both a very festive Christmas.
Mr. Oliver Dowden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The triumphant Star Wars saga began life at Elstree Studios in my constituency, which continues to produce hits such as The King's Speech and Suffragette. Well,
The honourable gentleman is banging on very eloquently about Star Wars, and I want to hear it. Mr. Dowden.
will the Prime Minister join me in pledging support for our thriving British film industry, which makes such a valuable social, cultural and economic contribution in Hertsmere and across the United Kingdom?
I think my honourable friend raises an important point, because this is not only very exciting for children, and I have to say quite a lot of parents are looking forward to this film, but this is a film being made in Britain with many British actors, with some brilliant British technicians, showing the strength of the British film industry. And I would say this, but also backed by the British government and British taxpayers with the excellent resources that we provide. And let me just say to my honourable friend, as I've worked with him for so many years in so many different ways, I know that he will never join the dark side.
Danny Kinahan.
Thank you very much. Prime Minister, there's nothing I believe more passionately than in the Union, and yet with Scottish nationalism, English votes for English laws, various powerhouses and city deals, and the creation of numerous other measures that may threaten the Union, what is the Prime Minister's vision for that Union and for holding the four countries together? And would he please come and speak to the Union all-party group at some stage in the future, but even more importantly, would he help with a campaign throughout the Union, because we're better together?
The honourable gentleman, I'm passionate about our United Kingdom, and I believe we can make it stronger by accepting that it is a partnership of nations, and a partnership of nations where we should treat each other with respect. I don't want to listen to the SNP. They don't want a partnership, they want a separation. But actually, one of the things that is so strong about the United Kingdom, and that I think other countries frankly are quite jealous of, is we've demonstrated that you can have multiple identities. You can be proud of being an Ulsterman and a Brit. You can be proud of being a Hindu and a Scot. You can be proud of being both Welsh and British. We've solved one of the problems that the rest of the world is grappling with, and that's why we should keep our United Kingdom together.
Order.
And we come to the end of the final Prime Minister's questions of 2015. No more until the, is it the first or the second Wednesday? First Wednesday, I think it is, in January. So you'll just have to wait till then. A more traditional PMQs for the season of tradition. Mr. Corbyn, Leader of the Opposition, went back to asking a series of questions. Only in his final question did he crowdsource it to Abby, but it was within the theme because she's a midwife, and all his questions had been about the health service. And he moved from the bed blocking crisis, the lack of social care, or the cuts in social care, and whether the increase in the local government precept would be enough to make up for the cuts. He thought not. And there were some detailed questions, actually, from Mr Corbyn that we didn't quite get full answers from the Prime Minister. Donald Trump got a mention as well, not very popular in the House of Commons. He lost in the Supreme Court his appeal to try and stop the offshore wind offshore the Aberdeenshire golf course that he has built. His reaction to that is he's called the Scottish Government foolish, small-minded and with a parochial mentality. But given what he called the Mexicans, the Scots have got off quite lightly there this time. What did our viewers make of it?
They weren't quite so insulting, I have to say, our viewers. Noah McGivern on Twitter said, clearly Jeremy Corbyn can't even wish David Cameron happy Christmas without his words being distorted. Martin Bristow said, interesting to see Diane Abbott move to sit beside Jeremy Corbyn, presumably for moral support. On the substance, Corbyn once again was very weak. To argue that the NHS is underfunded when not committing his party to fund it is pathetic. Labour are relying on the magic money tree, not hard choices. You don't govern like that. But Joe Moore says the politicians can't all be wrong, nor can they all be right. But by listening to David Cameron, one would think that the NHS has no problems at all. Jeremy Corbyn comes over as more believable and surely has ended 2015 on a winning note. And this from Luke on Twitter. This is the first Cameron-Corbyn PMQs I've properly watched. I have to say that Cameron is bossing it. Corbyn seems out of his depth.
Many people, when they saw the rise of Mr Corbyn this summer and the subsequent victory, thought that this was an interregnum, that this was just going to be a short, brief period in British politics before a return to more normality, as they would regard it. When you see that today, that doesn't look like it's true, does it? This is the shape of British politics now.
I think certainly for some time. Now, it depends, of course, who you talk to. It depends who you ask. But, you know, one MP was saying to me the other day, they're characterising of this year as having been a completely extraordinary year in politics, all sorts of things that happened that are completely unpredictable, but then went on to say that next year, maybe what he described as a year of the unthinkables, where we might have something completely unexpected on the European Union, which have all sorts of consequences in the way that Angus Robertson was there suggesting the impacts with Scotland if the UK voted to leave. There might be a UK Labour leadership challenge if the results go against Jeremy Corbyn in May. There are certainly people inside the Labour Party who are planning for that. They are a minority, but there are people who are planning for that. Not much on the piece of paper that you would actually call a concrete plan, but that is under consideration by people. And there is this sense somehow that the last few months have been extraordinary, but next year maybe equally extraordinary. So I think you're right. We are at a sense where it's sort of not an interregnum. This shape does feel to have sort of settled down a bit. But I don't think we should lull ourselves into a sense that next year things will just carry on as they have done.
Yes.
Presumably, we focus very much on Jeremy Corbyn and his leadership, and understandably so. But one thing we said during the election is that it was one about competence versus chaos, and that was derided in some quarters. And what we've seen is the Labour Party descend into chaos immediately post the election. UKIP is a party of chaos. And so whatever configuration we're in next year, I don't see a scenario in which Labour moves from being a party of chaos to a party of competence, Corbyn or no Corbyn.
What do you say to that?
Well, you may not have the best insight in that, but some people's chaos is other people's recognition of differences. And the fact that, for instance, recently we had that free vote on Syria reflected differences of view widely held in the public, including in your party. And that was part of what he was saying about politics needing to be done differently, and I think has been welcomed. I mean, I think today we saw again quite an understated style, and I think by not being so combative, to being more reasonable, one of your viewers said he was believable, and I think that's allowed him to make some headway, and particularly when he does quote from ordinary people, it reinforces the sense that he is in touch, he's expressing what people are really feeling. And I think he's doing okay at Prime Minister's questions and winning on things like tax credits, forcing your climb down and back peddling because of that sort of approach.
I think one of the interesting things, though, if you stand back from the sort of weekly joust between those two men, David Cameron hasn't really looked under very much pressure since the general election. And this government is doing lots of things not particularly well. Of course, they have some individual successes, some individual huge problems like the mess that they got into over tax credits. But there are lots of areas when in a more traditional era, they might be under real pressure. I mean, let's think about today, for example. David Cameron is in a very, very high stakes renegotiation, trying to do something that nobody has ever really managed to do before with the rest of the EU. It is not going entirely according to plan. But yet he got through that session and has got through the last few days and the last few weeks relatively unrattled by all of this. So sort of as an observation that the government is not doing everything brilliantly well. They've taken some very big risks. They really look under pressure.
Are we right to think that that Mr. Cameron and Mr. Osborne too, the Chancellor, they would quite like to get this referendum out of the way next year rather than wait to 2017?
There's no question about that. They desperately want to get this done in June if they can. That is their preferred date. They think that is still possible because they hope, and it does look feasible, that there could be a deal in February. That would give them then the 4 months required in order to have a decent period of
Could
debate.
they have it in June? I was told that the Electoral Commission didn't like the idea of a referendum campaign taking place while the May elections in local government in England, the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Assembly.
Well, it would be
and Northern
complicated.
Ireland,
It would certainly be complicated. But that is their hope. That is their preferred option, is to do it in June.
Even with the polls narrowing the way they have.
Well, that's one of the reasons why they want to act so quickly. There's sort of a sense that the longer they leave it, the more of a risk it is.
And they want it in June before the next summer's migrant crisis gets underway.
Indeed, and other European leaders want it soon too, because then you get into the complication of French and German elections in 2017. So there is desire on all sides to try to get it done quickly. It is sort of penciled into the diary as a political hope in as far as this government is concerned, but given the complexities of it all that we were discussing before Prime Minister's questions, there's nothing certain about it happening.
About a June.
And
of course September, if there is another migrant crisis, September could be even worse.
It could be even
time, because then you've had the whole summer of these same pictures again. Were you surprised to learn that the government, the hospitals are running up a deficit of 2.2 billion, and the government's response to that is to force them to borrow the money?
Well, I mean, the demands on our health service are immense. I think the starting position is committing to fund the Stevens plan, and that's not a plan generated by the government. It's the independent chief executive of the NHS, which we have done.
But except that there are now in a deficit of over 2 billion. And 21 NHS trusts and 10 foundation hospitals trusts have had to borrow between them over £500 million from the government. They've borrowed. Now, traditionally, this was done as a grant. It was done through the public dividend capital, which is a grant. They're now borrowing and having to pay interest, borrowing to be able to pay this month's doctors' salaries, this month's nurses' salaries, this month's administration salaries. Is that sensible?
Well, we fully funded the Stevens plan. If there is a need there is a need to get short-term capital and there is a proper structure in place to do so, then by all means that's absolutely fine.
It's not capital; it's running costs. Doctors' salaries are not capital.
I mean, what it means if they need extra funding,
but they've never, and they're having to pay 1.5% interest on this, and they will have to pay it back as well. Is that feasible?
Well, I think it's what the Prime Minister said in Prime Minister's Question Time is absolutely where we should be, that we should be looking to fund this. Yes, there might be short-term pressures, in which case we should put in place the appropriate structure for them to get the funds they need so that they can treat all those people in winter who would need care immediately, and that's what we should be doing.
The government must hope that it's absolutely right about climate change and that this winter stays as mild as it is, because if we had a severe winter like 4 or 5 years ago, that were already a deficit of over 2 billion, the deficit would soar in the NHS.
And there's absolutely no question now that there are enormous strains on the health service with the way things are at the moment. There's no question about that. And the figures that Jeremy Corbyn was bringing up and what you've just been talking about, some hospitals having to sort of, phone the bank manager.
Give me a loan. The bank manager being Jeremy Hunt.
Indeed. The central problem on this is that if you talk to ministers, they believe that the Simons plan, put together by the very well-respected boss of the NHS, will, in 2 or 3 years, in theory, start to deliver the money back, as well as making a system that should be more joined up, functioning better, where you don't have crazy things like an elderly person who's been ill being stuck in hospital because there's nobody to take them home or nobody to make sure that they're okay once they're actually back in their own house. The crunch is the time lag. If the savings that you can get from the NHS and really quite significant reforms that most people in the sector and in government would say actually have to happen, if they can't be delivered for 3 or 4 years, then there is going to be a very tricky point in the interim.
Right, we shall keep an eye on that. Laura, thank you for being with us. Merry Christmas.
And to you, I was going to bring mince pies, but I didn't have time. But I wonder if I can have my own colouring book.
Oh,
you didn't bring mince pies, and you want one of our
Yes,
colouring
I'll
books.
take.
And a happy
I think you'll find that's the prize, John Healy, before you give away our prize.
Okay, well maybe. Is there an Andrew and Joe one for next year? That would be the thing.
The Joe Cole colouring book.
Happy Christmas.
Yes, to you too.
That's all, folks.